The man they called Samuel was a fixture of the town's pity, a man tethered to a patch of earth so unforgiving it seemed to mock the very concept of growth. His small plot of land, visible from the main road into Redemption Creek, was a testament to failure, its dusty soil yielding only stunted corn and withered-looking beans. The townsfolk saw him as a simple, hard-working fool, too stubborn to admit defeat and move on. They watched him work his back under the relentless summer sun, his shoulders stooped, his face perpetually grimed with the pale dirt that refused to grant him a living. He spoke little, bought only the barest necessities from the mercantile, and retreated each evening to a shack that looked as weary as he did. His isolation was a wall, and his poverty was the uniform he wore to keep the world at a comfortable distance. What they never saw was the way his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, would scan the horizon not with despair, but with a keen, assessing patience. They did not see the intelligence that lay dormant behind his quiet facade, or the strength in his hands that was honed by a labor far greater than the tilling of his barren acre. The truth of Samuel was a secret kept by the silent, sun-baked hills that rose behind his property, a secret that lived and breathed in a hidden valley where the soil was black and rich, and life flourished with an almost violent abundance. He had built this life of dualities with meticulous care, a fortress of perception designed to shield him from the avarice he had known before. He wanted something real, something that could grow in poor soil, and he was willing to wait for it, no matter how long the seasons of his loneliness stretched on. She arrived on a day when the heat pressed down like a physical weight, shimmering in waves above the dusty street. Her name was Ming, and she was a splash of impossible color in a world of brown and gray. Dressed in a cheongsam of dark, lustrous red, the fabric clinging to her slender frame, she moved with a deliberate grace that was utterly alien to the hurried, practical gaits of the townswomen. She was 18, her face a smooth, unreadable mask, her black hair coiled in an intricate knot at the nape of her neck. The people of Redemption Creek stared. They saw the dress, the exotic face, the quiet dignity, and they did not understand it. They saw a creature, not a person. Whispers followed her like a cloud of flies. When she did not shrink from their gazes, when she met their hard stares with a calm, level look of her own, they decided she was unnatural. When she was seen tracing the intricate patterns of a spider's web with one delicate finger, a faint smile on her lips, they called her crazy. The label stuck, a burr on her existence. Ming was the crazy Chinese girl who worked at the laundry, her hands plunged into scalding water for hours, her spirit seemingly untouched by the scorn that surrounded her. She did not plead or bargain for their acceptance. She simply existed, a silent, vibrant rebuke to their narrow world, her red dress a flag of defiance planted in the heart of their drab, fearful town. She saw the world not as they did, but as a tapestry of small, overlooked wonders, the precise geometry of a cracked pane of glass, the deep purple hue of a shadow in the late afternoon, the resilience of a single weed pushing its way through the hardened earth. Their first real encounter was a thing of silence and small gestures. It happened in the mercantile, a place thick with the scent of sawdust, coffee beans, and dried goods. Ming was there to purchase a small sack of rice, her coins counted out carefully on the worn countertop. Samuel stood nearby, his pretense of poverty demanding he haggle over the price of a handful of nails. A clumsy boy, running through the store, knocked a crate of apples from its perch. They tumbled across the floorboards, a cascade of bruised fruit. The storekeeper bellowed in frustration. Ming, without a word, knelt down, her red dress pooling around her as she began to gather them. Samuel watched her for a moment, his face impassive. Then he too bent to the task. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same apple. Her fingers were slender and wet from her work at the laundry, yet the touch was warm. He drew his hand back as if stung. She merely looked at him, her dark eyes holding his for a second longer than was comfortable. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, searching curiosity. He saw in that brief glance that she did not see the town's fool. She saw a man. He straightened up, his sack of nails forgotten, and placed the apples he had collected back into the crate before turning and leaving the store without a word. The moment hung in the air, insignificant to everyone but the two people who had shared it. That night, Ming thought of the calloused roughness of his hand against hers, and Samuel, walking the perimeter of his true and hidden fields, thought of the startling, unwavering clarity in her eyes. He began to watch her. From the shaded porch of his decoy shack, he could see the back of the laundry, a grim, windowless building that steamed in the summer heat. He saw her emerge in the evenings, her shoulders aching, to tend a small, illicit patch of ground behind the building. In soil almost as poor as his own public plot, she coaxed life from the dirt, nurturing a few straggly herbs and a single determined gourd vine. He recognized the patient, focused movements of someone who understood the language of the earth. He saw the way she would gently turn a leaf over, checking for blight, or crumble the soil between her fingers to test its moisture. This was not the act of a crazy person. It was the act of a survivor, a creator. One evening, after the moon had risen, he walked from his hidden valley, carrying a tomato so perfect it seemed unreal. It was heavy in his palm, its skin a deep, flawless crimson, smelling of sun and rich soil. He knew nothing like it could ever grow in the parched ground of Redemption Creek. He left it on the weathered fence post nearest her small garden, a silent offering. The next day, he watched from his porch as she discovered it. She stopped, her hand hovering over it for a long moment. She picked it up, turning it over and over, her expression one of profound wonder. She looked around, her gaze sweeping over the dusty landscape, lingering for a moment on his distant, dilapidated shack. She did not know its origin for certain, but she understood it was a message. It was a secret, shared between the man everyone pitied and the woman everyone scorned. She took the tomato inside, and he knew she would not question the miracle. She would simply accept it. The silent exchange continued. A few perfect ears of sweet corn, their kernels like rows of pale gold, appeared by her garden. Then a handful of green beans, crisp and tender. He never let her see him, but the gifts were a conversation spoken in the language of the harvest. For her part, Ming began to leave things for him. On the same fence post, he would find a small, intricately folded paper crane one day, and a single, perfect white feather the next. They were things of beauty, not sustenance, answers to his questions that she sensed he was not yet ready to ask aloud. She was telling him that she saw beauty where others saw desolation, and that she recognized the same spirit in him. The town, meanwhile, continued its campaign of quiet cruelty. They saw her strange little collection on the fence post, and it only confirmed their diagnosis of her madness. "Talking to ghosts," one woman sniffed to another as they passed the laundry. "Leaving trinkets for the spirits." Samuel, hearing these comments in town, felt a slow burn of anger in his chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome emotion. His isolation had always been a shield, but now he felt it as a failure. He was hiding not just his wealth, but himself, and in doing so, he was leaving her to face their judgment alone. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he was beginning to realize he had also built himself a prison, and she was on the other side of the wall, tending her small garden in the shadow of his deception, offering him paper cranes he felt he did not deserve. The distance between his dusty shack and her small room behind the laundry felt vast, a chasm of unspoken truths and carefully constructed lies. The tension finally found a voice in the town square. Ming was walking back from the creek, carrying her bucket, when Martha, the wife of the town's self-important blacksmith, blocked her path. Martha was a woman whose own insecurities were sharpened into a weapon she wielded against anyone she deemed lesser. "You," she said, her voice loud enough for the men loitering outside the saloon to hear. "I saw that thing you left on the fence. Are you trying to put a curse on this town with your strange magic?" Ming stood perfectly still, her face calm. She did not speak. Her silence seemed to infuriate Martha more than any retort could have. "Look at her," Martha sneered to the onlookers. "Dumb as a post and crazy as a loon. We don't want your kind here." Samuel was across the square, ostensibly inspecting a harness buckle he had no intention of buying. He heard every word. The town watched, waiting for the girl to cry or run. Samuel did neither. He simply stopped what he was doing and turned his head. He looked at Martha. He did not glower or threaten. He just looked, his gaze steady and heavy, carrying a weight that no one in Redemption Creek had ever felt from him before. It was the look of a man who owned things, a man who made decisions, a man who was not to be trifled with. Under that silent, unnerving pressure, Martha faltered. Her blustering anger deflated, leaving behind a pout of confusion. She muttered something under her breath and pushed past Ming, her moment of power broken. Samuel held his gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the harness. No one understood what had just happened, but they felt a shift. The town's fool had, for a brief second, looked like a king. Ming, from across the square, met his eyes, and a small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. A few days later he found her by the creek at dusk, washing the laundry's linens in the fading light. The relentless work seemed endless. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, but there was no alarm in her eyes. "The herbs," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "In your garden, what are they?" It was the first real question he had ever asked her. She paused, wringing out a heavy sheet. "For healing," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "For sleep. For memory." She looked at his hands, which he had unconsciously clenched into fists at his sides. "The soil," she said, her own question a mirror of his. "The soil on your clothes is red and poor, but the tomato, it grew in black soil, rich soil." He did not answer, his jaw tightening. The lie was there between them, a tangible thing. She did not press him. Instead, she reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a dried flower. It was delicate, with pale, paper-thin petals. "This one is for courage," she said, holding it out to him. He looked from the flower to her face. He saw no judgment there, no accusation, only a quiet offering, a continuation of their silent conversation. He reached out and took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers once more. "Thank you," he managed to say. He stood there for a long moment, the tiny flower a fragile weight in his big hand, the sound of the creek and the coming night filling the silence. It was the beginning of trust, a seed planted in the difficult ground between his secret and her perception. The catalyst came on a sweltering afternoon. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the laundry, was a sour, grasping man who saw Ming not as an employee but as a piece of equipment he had begrudgingly acquired. He had been losing money at cards and decided to take his frustrations out on his most vulnerable target. Samuel was walking past, on his way to his shack, when he heard Henderson's angry voice shouting from the alley behind the laundry. "It's not enough! You're lazy, you eat too much, and your strangeness is bad for business," Henderson bellowed. "I want you out by morning." Samuel stopped, hidden by the corner of the building. He saw Ming standing before the man, her back straight, her hands clasped behind her. She did not beg or plead. She simply absorbed his tirade with that unnerving stillness of hers. But Samuel saw the slight tremor in her hands, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. She had nothing. She had nowhere to go. This man was about to cast her out into a world that already despised her, and she would be utterly alone. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of his deception became unbearable. His charade of poverty, his shield, was now a cage that prevented him from acting, from protecting the one person who had seen past it. He watched Henderson storm back inside, leaving Ming standing alone amidst the steam and the lie. Her composure finally broke, not in a flood of tears, but in a single, slow slump of her shoulders, a gesture of profound and utter weariness. Samuel knew he could not let it happen. The game was over. The cost of his secret had just become too high. He waited until the last light had bled from the sky, and then he went to her. He didn't knock on the door to her small room behind the laundry. He simply stood in the shadows by her garden until she emerged, a small bundle of her few possessions in her hands. She saw him and stopped, her face illuminated by the rising moon. "Come with me," he said. It was not a request. It was a simple statement of fact. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, searching his face in the dim light. She saw the gravity there, the end of one thing and the beginning of another. She gave a single nod. He led her away from the town, not towards his dilapidated shack, but away from it, up into the rolling hills that formed the town's harsh backdrop. The path was steep and unmarked, a trail only he knew. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the scent of dust and sage giving way to pine and damp earth. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the moon their only guide. The landscape transformed around them. The scrubby bushes were replaced by tall trees, and the silence was broken by the sound of rushing water. Finally, they crested a high ridge. He stopped and turned to her. Below them, nestled in a valley, shielded on all sides by the rocky peaks, lay a world of impossible green. Under the moonlight, it looked like a dark, sleeping jewel. A large, well-built farmhouse stood at its center, its windows dark. Fields stretched out in neat, shimmering rows, and the lowing of cattle echoed softly in the night air. It was a kingdom. "This," Samuel said, his voice quiet but resonant in the stillness, "this is me." He watched her face, bracing for the shock, the anger, the accusation. He had shown her a lie, and now he was showing her a truth so vast it dwarfed the lie completely. But Ming did not look at the house, or the sheer scale of the livestock pens, or the endless rows of crops. Instead, she walked past him to the edge of the valley overlook and knelt down. She reached out and touched the earth, letting the dark, rich soil run through her fingers. It was the soil she had imagined, the soil that had birthed the perfect tomato. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. There was no anger. There was only a deep, profound understanding. "You were afraid," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was the final piece of their conversation, the words for what the feather and the flower and the tomato had been trying to say all along. He had been afraid of being wanted for what he had, not for who he was. He had hidden his bounty to protect his soul. "Yes," he admitted, the word a release of a pressure he had been holding for years. She stood up and walked to him, the dark red of her dress a stark, beautiful slash of color against the moonlit landscape. She did not touch him, but stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "Here," she said, looking out over the sleeping valley, "things grow." She was not talking about the corn or the tomatoes or the cattle. She was talking about him, about them. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time without the filter of his lies, and saw not the crazy girl from the town, but the woman who had recognized the truth of him in a handful of dirt. The long season of his loneliness was finally over.